How is it that covering stories around the environment has become such a dangerous job?
A journalist who exposed dubious land deals tied to a motorcycle, dragged several meters and then beaten.
One of the most dangerous things to report on is the mining industry.
More than 40 journalists around the world were killed while reporting on environmental stories.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. When journalists talk about the most dangerous beats in the news business, they talk about war zones or trying to cover drug cartels in Mexico. However, environmental reporting is not far behind. According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, in the past decade, 13 reporters doing environmentally related work have been killed. Another 16 such deaths are currently under investigation. The environment beat is perilous because it often involves exposing the abuses taking place as more and more minerals are extracted, lucrative minerals. And when there's enough money involved, there will be those who are willing to kill for their share of it. Still, those stories keep coming out, especially when the reporters involved, thinking about safety in numbers, join forces. Later in this program, we'll hear from George Monbiot, a journalist and climate campaigner who has spent the past 3 decades crusading against the practices of the fossil fuel industry, the inertia of the political class, and the complicity of the corporate news outlets that have failed to give environmental stories adequate coverage. But first, The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead on the dangers of that kind of journalism and a new media collaboration designed to protect reporters and get those stories out.
In the mid-1990s, there was a real estate boom in India. Construction around the country skyrocketed. Concrete was in high demand, as was the sand that goes into it. So sand mining grew into a billion-dollar industry. Environmental regulations were put in place to try and limit the mass excavation that was taking place, but they did little to help. Today, illegal mines are removing billions of tons of sand a year, with devastating effects on the environment. Land, water bodies, and entire ecosystems are being destroyed. In addition, labor is exploited, local populations are abused, and corruption is rife. The organizations that operate these illegal mines are known in India as the Sand Mafias. And for the journalists covering the story and exposing their criminality, it can be deadly work. This is Jagendra Singh, a journalist from the North Indian state of Uttar Pradesh.
The problem actually began when Jagendra Singh began to receive a lot of information about the illegal activities and corruption by a minister of the then ruling party in the North Indian state of Uttar Pradesh.
In 2015, after a campaign of harassment, he was set on fire by local people and police, allegedly. He survived for 7 days and then eventually died.
The Sand Mafia are extremely powerful in India, ready to do a lot of things to silence reporters. Not only Jagendra was killed, but that sand from India is traveling all around the world. So that's why it's not only an Indian story, that's a global story.
Nickel is used in the batteries of electric cars. As more and more drivers try to reduce their carbon emissions by going electric, the demand for nickel has increased. But while these cars may help with air pollution in developed countries, they appear to be taking a devastating toll on the environment in Guatemala. In 2014, a Swiss mining conglomerate, the Solway Group, reopened a dormant nickel mine at the Phoenix site near Lake Isabel, the largest lake in Guatemala. Then came the stories: illnesses, skin rashes, air pollution, water shortages, failed crops, poisoned fish. And then in March 2017, Lake Isabel turned red. Angered by the government's slow response to their grievances, the local fishermen's union blockaded the mine, bringing operations to a standstill. The standoff lasted weeks, costing the company millions. Pressure began to mount on the local authorities to end the blockade. On March 27th, tensions at the Phoenix mine boiled over. Local journalist Carlos Choc was there with his camera.
Se realiza una manifestación de la gremial de pescadores.
Nos trasladamos al lugar, el
We went up to the mine at 12:30, and already we could see that the riot police had been deployed, as well as the special ops unit.
And it all seems rather premeditated. So the local police force is supplemented, the riot police are there, they start to fire tear gas, and then they start to fire live rounds.
At that moment, in the middle of everything, when you see all this tear gas flying about, you see they start firing. That was when I was able to document with my camera. I didn't just see the murder of fisherman Carlos Mas, I actually documented it.
That night, Choc went on a local news channel to give his account of what happened, which contradicted the official version given on the same broadcast by a police spokesman who said they weren't even carrying weapons, let alone firing at unarmed fishermen.
After this broadcast went out, I received really serious threats. That night they called me 3 times. I remember clearly. In the first call they said, "Carlos, where are you at? We want to talk to you." Local people were coming up to me saying, "Carlos, there are a lot of cops in town. They have a list, and we've heard that your name's on it." Then, on August 4th, 2017, the magistrate issued an arrest warrant against 7 fishermen and myself, a journalist.
It's never acknowledged that he's a journalist. He's described as a sindicalista, a trade unionist, i.e. a member of the Fishermen's Union, and at that point he goes into hiding.
I was living in hiding for a year and a half with no contact with the outside world. I had to be on the run, keeping a low profile. I couldn't even go shopping, because I had an arrest warrant out on me.
Jagendra Singh and Carlos Choc are just 2 environmental journalists among many who have been targeted for their work, and in both cases there is strong evidence to suggest that local law enforcement was not only culpable but acting on orders from above, which begs the question, why would local law enforcement and the politicians they work under put the interests of the mining sector ahead of public safety concerns? And usually you can find the answer to that question by following the money. Last year, the top 40 mining companies in the world earned $683 billion, and there's a lucrative trickle-down from that. Typically, these companies will have multiple operations around the world, but will outsource a lot of the day-to-day work, like labor, transport, or security, to local companies, which are often owned or connected to local politicians. And if journalists expose environmental abuses taking place at these mines, it can jeopardize the entire operation.
So these journalists, many of them often coming from indigenous communities without a lot of power and status, are taking on the most powerful elites in their countries and globally as well, if you look at mining multinationals, for example.
There's always a nexus between politicians, local law enforcement authorities and industrialists. And when we connect the dots, we find that these people are exploiting not just natural resources, but also a very large section of the underprivileged across the world. And it's journalists who are in touch with these local population, with these local citizens, and they bring out this nexus.
Now, many of these issues happen in most cases in developing countries. Now, this doesn't mean that developed countries don't have a role to play, because many of the extractive industries that we see doing these activities that pollute the environment are actually foreign companies. So you have American companies, Canadian companies, European companies with investments in developing countries where environmental regulations are not as strict as they are in the developed world, or they are not enforced in the same way.
So it's a double standards problem. It's fine, you know, for me to be involved in a business that does this abroad. I wouldn't do it at home. And often the lack of care taken with the environment is what sparks local conflict, which then leads to clashes in which journalists get caught up.
So those stories are extremely important to show to the consumers how big brands are pretending to be green, but when you look at more precisely the supply chain, then you can discover that they are not that green.
Laurent Richard is the founder of Forbidden Stories, a network of journalists based in Paris that continues the work of other reporters facing threats, prison, or murder. Its latest project is called Green Blood, which is being made into a documentary that will be released next year.
You came here for a very important reason. It's about finishing the work of assassinated or under threat reporters.
It's brought together 40 reporters from around the world to carry on the investigations of environmental journalists who have been silenced, including Jagendra Singh and Carlos Chok. In June, the project went live, publishing in 32 news outlets across the globe.
That's extremely important to do that kind of collaboration because we are sending a powerful signal to enemies of the free press that you wanted to silence the reporters, you will never silence the story. Because now the story is published in New York, in Nairobi, in France, in South America, everywhere.
While Jagendra Singh reported on the Sand Mafias in North India, Sandhya Ravishankar, editor of The Lead, has been covering them in the South, which has also come with consequences. Ravishankar says that she has been constantly harassed, starting with lawsuits but escalating to rape threats, being followed. There was even CCTV footage leaked online of her meeting with the source, a not-so-subtle reminder that she and those she speaks to are being watched. Ravishankar was also one of the journalists who worked on the Green Blood project.
One of the key things that a journalist sitting in Chennai was unable to crack was the export data. So when investigative journalists from Forbidden Stories, The Guardian, Le Monde, Die Zeit and Süddeutsche Zeitung, when all of them came together and pitched in with freedom of information requests being filed in their own countries, they went and they spoke to the end users in their countries, the people who were importers of beach sand minerals, and this sort of took everything to a completely different macro scale. So it was not just this one journalist in the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu, but it became something that people across the world, readers and viewers across the world could relate to.
That's the red stain.
Julia Garside is an investigative journalist with The Guardian newspaper and also a member of the Green Blood project. She traveled to Guatemala to work with Carlos Chok on the Phoenix mine story.
So when we visited some of the nearby villages, we found that a lot of people, particularly children, had skin rashes.
It's been 2 years since Carlos Chok was charged. However, he is still awaiting trial because his court date keeps getting delayed. While in the country, Garside followed up on his case, but in doing so, got an insight into what is known in Guatemala as criminalization. It's when innocent people are accused of a crime so that they can be dragged into the legal system and therefore more easily controlled.
We went to the court on the day that one of Carlos's hearings was due to happen. We were all hoping the case would be dismissed. The judge refused to see him, and we had concerns about this judge, and we asked for an interview. He wouldn't see us. We came back the next day with the cameraman and tried and interview him, and his staff ushered us out again and said, "You've just broken the law, you're not allowed into the courtroom." And we said, "Well, the courtroom is a public place." "Oh, yeah, you've broken the law." Anyway, so we sat down, and then they came a bit later and said, Would you like an interview with the judge? He'll give you an interview if you give us your IDs. So we gave our press cards, and she came back. She said, "I've photocopied your press cards. The judge has decided not to grant you an interview, and he would like me to remind you that you've broken the law today in this courtroom." So you get a little bit of a flavour of how this criminalisation works.
On July 31st, Carlos Chok went to court for the 10th time, and once again, his case was delayed. Chok says that there is no evidence to support the charges against him, yet the judge still won't drop his case. While the apparent criminalization of Chok continues, there has been a development in the story he was covering. 1 month after the Green Blood project went live, Guatemala's constitutional court ruled in favor of the Fishermen's Union and suspended operations at the Phoenix mine. The court found that the Ministry of Energy and Mines had failed to carry out a proper consultation with the local population when it granted the mine a license. In response to the ruling, the Solway Group said that its operations are always performed in accordance with the law, but it will certainly follow the court's decision. However, as an employer responsible for the lives of over 2,000 staff members and their families, we will take all possible measures not to halt our operations. In protecting their livelihoods and the environment, the fishermen may have put the miners out of a job. There are no easy answers in these stories, but thanks to Carlos Choc and journalists like him, they don't go unreported.
As journalists, we have to come together and cooperate so that it's no longer just a single voice or a single outlet. It's no longer Carlos Choc alone who is speaking out. It's a whole lot of voices, together. So for me, this is very important. This would always be better, to tell how things really are, together with other media, with other journalists.
Media play many different roles in society, one of which is to put issues on the agenda, both the political agenda and the public agenda. So there's this saying that media are not very good at telling us how to think, but they're very effective in telling us what to think about. So if the media cover environmental issues, people are more willing and more prepared to talk about environmental issues, to think about environmental issues.
Well, we journalists are only the messengers, and it's really up to the public, the people, the consumers of the news, to actually put pressure on their politicians, on their governments, to ensure that such exploitation of natural resources of the underprivileged does not take place.
The journalists at the forefront of environmental reporting expose the causes and culprits of ecological devastation and the consequences for local communities. George Monbiot, a British journalist and environmental campaigner, cut his teeth in this field more than 3 decades ago. He's investigated the damage done by corporations and governments from the Amazon to East Africa, and now devotes his energies to the bigger picture, climate change. Monbiot's weekly column in the British paper, The Guardian, can have a polarizing effect on audiences. He's widely read, but has also been derided as an alarmist. However, as the years have passed and temperatures and water levels have risen, the political and media mainstream have come around to what Monbiot's been saying all along, that humanity is facing an unprecedented threat that only rapid decarbonization can prevent. I spoke with George Monbiot about a career spent in reporting on climate issues and the mainstream media's track record on this story. George Monbiot, thanks for joining us here at The Listening Post today.
Thank you.
It's not as though climate change hasn't been covered by the news media. The criticism is about the amount of coverage and the urgency that's lacking. Why do you think media outlets, often not adverse to shocking or scaring viewers, because that's part of the formula, why do you think they take an opposite approach, or have, with this particular story?
They have quite deliberately played it down. It depends which media outlets you're talking about. If you look at the billionaire press, the newspapers owned by billionaires, they have a very clear interest in not emphasizing climate breakdown, because doing so directly offends some of their commercial interests. It offends the commercial interests of the billionaire class as a whole. In the broadcast media, it's long been perceived as counter-aspirational.
Today, I'm house hunting on the stunning Caribbean island of Antigua.
The programs they like to make are all about wonderful houses.
This is where the magic happens.
And amazing things you can buy and great holidays you can go on. And climate breakdown and environmental breakdown more generally are the spectre at the feast, saying actually all this apparent progress is progress towards disaster. And that's not just in the UK, it's around the world. I've met journalists from Mexico, from India, from Southeast Asia, who all tell me the same thing, that they as journalists are desperate to cover the issues, but the senior figures within their organisations just keep nixing it. They keep saying no.
These are the people who have to answer to shareholders.
Well, they have to answer to shareholders and public sector broadcasters. They maybe feel they have to answer to government, because I think it's much more than just straightforward self-interest. You know, obviously there are commercial interests at play, there are political interests at play, but there's also a deep fear, a real fear of opening up this box for fear of what it might reveal. And with an issue like this, to admit anything is to admit everything. As soon as you start saying, okay, so climate breakdown is real, then you start challenging pretty well everything we do. The way we travel to work, the work we do when we get there, the way we spend the money that we get from that work. In fact, you start to question the entire basis of the economy. What if growth turns out to be progress not towards enrichment, but towards general destitution? So you can see that the moment you lift that lid, the moment you start covering the issue and asking the questions, you have to question everything. And most people find that terrifying.
One of the things one often hears from mainstream journalists when they're called out for not covering the story enough is it's a bit of a ratings killer, it's a turn-off. People don't really click on this kind of story, and I'm just wondering whether you feel that there's actually merit to that argument.
Quite often, when I've pushed people for evidence, they simply don't come up with it. And there is no evidence, it's just a feeling they've got. An
impression.
They live in a bit of a bubble, executives in media organisations. You know, hippies know that they're a culture. Punks know that they're a culture. Media executives do not know that they're a culture. They're a very particular culture. They've got a very particular worldview. And it is not the worldview of everyone. They present themselves as speaking for the ordinary man and woman, but they are very far from being the ordinary man and woman. But sometimes they might have a point. Sometimes maybe their coverage is turning people off. Maybe their economics coverage turns people off. Maybe their political coverage turns people off. But in those cases, they say, perhaps we should do it better, because we're not going to stop covering economics. We're not going to stop covering politics. But when it comes to environmental issues, they say, oh, we'll just stop covering it.
Is it possible to actually get a grip on how much damage the media have done through their lack of reporting on this story?
There's no question it has massively impeded action, because politicians won't act until they are pushed into acting. And it's very hard to get people mobilised if you're not hearing it on media which is being generally consumed. It's been pushed to the margins, to the fringes, onto social media, onto alternative media. And that's incredibly useful, it's very important, but it's not enough. Unless it's also on the mainstream media, then the people who are operating at the margins are always going to struggle to reach people who just haven't heard that message.
I want to talk about something you wrote way back in 2007. The editorials urge us to cut our emissions. The ads urge us to raise them. Do you see a tension between those two imperatives?
The tension is almost overwhelming sometimes. I don't particularly blame any media outlet for it, because they've all got to keep themselves afloat. And at the moment, most of them depend on advertising for their revenue. I would like to see media outlets ceasing to take advertising for oil companies, for gas companies, for cars, for planes, for holidays which require flights. And I don't think that's too much to ask. These are industries which should be on the way out anyway.
You've been at this for a while, and I'm sure the banging your head against the wall metaphor has come up from time to time. Do you feel that that wall is finally starting to crumble, if only a little bit?
It's been 34 years so far. Occasionally it feels like the wall's crumbling, occasionally it feels like my head's crumbling. Things are changing, and they're changing, I think, primarily because of the uprising by young people who say we're not putting up with this any longer. By the incredible school strikes, the youth climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion and similar movements around the world, mainstream media is very scared about this because they think, where is our audience going to come from? But also, it's often been immensely frustrating. I've been shouted at, I've been sworn at by very senior TV executives when I've politely suggested perhaps this is an important topic to cover, that there's a huge hole in the coverage, perhaps here's a way of filling it. They have been absolutely clear that they did not want environmental coverage on their channels. As a result, if you were to ask me, who has done more to impede action on climate breakdown, the media or the oil companies? I'd say the media.
George Monbiot of The Guardian, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
On George Monbiot's last point, that the news media bear more responsibility for inaction on climate change than fossil fuel companies do, journalists are supposed to speak truth to power. No one really expects that of the Exxons and BPs of this world. But to varying degrees, many media outlets, this one included, are still dependent on the consumption-driven, fossil fuel-powered economy. Just ask their advertising departments or their shareholders struggling to deal with the industry's economic crisis, the digitally generated existential one. Those people are more interested in bottom lines than future generations. Their jobs, profits, and dividends all depend on it. And as long as news outlets are as addicted to fossil fuels as their viewers and readers are, the climate change story will never get the coverage it deserves. You've been watching a special edition of our program on the media and the environment. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.